He stood by the road, heart racing as the officers searched his bag. Then, the radio crackled. They knew his name. Their confidence shattered, replaced by fear. What had he done? What happened next will shock you. But let's start from the beginning. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows on the quiet streets of suburban Atlanta. James Foster, tired from a long day's work, walked along the sidewalk, his eyes distant, focused on the promise of home. His steps were slow, deliberate. Nothing about him suggested urgency. He simply wanted peace after the grind. But then, the sudden rev of an engine cut through the calm. James glanced over his shoulder as a patrol car pulled up beside him. The officers inside, Karen Reed and John Daniels, watched him closely as they rolled to a stop. They had no idea who he was. To them, he was just another man in their path. Reed stepped out of the car first, her expression set, authoritative. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice sharp. "Where are you headed? You seem to be in quite a hurry." Her gaze lingered on him, dissecting his every movement. There was something about him that unsettled her, but she couldn't put her finger on it. James didn't flinch. He simply met her eyes and said, "Just heading home." Reed didn't buy it. The suspicion was clear in her voice as she replied, "I'm going to need to see your ID." There was a dismissiveness there, a silent judgment that weighed heavier than the request itself. James didn't argue. He reached into his pocket and handed her his ID. She took it from him, scanning it with sharp eyes. "Foster, you look like the type who doesn't respect authority." The words hung in the air, sharp as a knife. She didn't wait for a response before barking an order to Daniels. The frustration hit James immediately. The injustice of it, the unfairness. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But his hands were forced against the hood of the patrol car, the rough metal biting into his skin. Daniels began rifling through his pockets, each movement further stripping him of dignity. The tension was thick. James kept his face neutral, though his mind churned with frustration. This wasn't just a stop. This was something more, something that had been building for far too long. The search dragged on, each second stretching like an hour. Officer Daniels rifled through James's bag with slow, deliberate movements, his hands pulling out items as though searching for something, anything, to justify the stop. Meanwhile, Officer Reed stood nearby, her eyes locked on James with an intensity that made him feel as if she were scanning every inch of him. "You're lucky we're not running a full background check right now," she sneered, her tone dripping with condescension. James's stomach tightened. The rage was there, bubbling just beneath the surface, but he kept it in check. He had been through this before, always the same. The unfairness, the targeting. It stung like a constant reminder that no matter how hard he worked or how much he tried to stay out of trouble, there was always someone waiting to put him in his place. But he had learned long ago that reacting would only make things worse. It would give them more power over him, and he wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. Reed's voice sliced through the air, sharp and mocking. "You got anything to say for yourself?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. James didn't answer. His gaze remained steady, though his chest burned with frustration. This wasn't just a routine stop. It was something deeper, something more personal. It was the color of his skin, the assumptions that came with it, and the constant reminder that, to some, he was never going to be seen as just a man. He would always be something else, something to be feared or controlled. As Daniels reached for his cuffs, ready to make the arrest, an unexpected interruption broke the tension. The sudden screech of a police radio cut through the silence, its crackling voice urgent, almost frantic. "Foster? Is that the James Foster?" the dispatcher asked, the words freezing the moment in place. For a brief, unsettling second, everything seemed to pause. The officers exchanged confused glances, their authority suddenly called into question. James felt a strange flicker of hope, but he kept his expression neutral. He wasn't sure what this meant, but whatever was happening next was about to change everything. Reed's face twisted into confusion as she processed the dispatcher's words. "Yeah, what about him?" she snapped, clearly irritated by the interruption. Her grip on the situation was slipping, but she was too proud to admit it. The dispatcher's voice, however, cut through her defiance with a note of sudden urgency. "You need to stop what you're doing immediately. That man is James Foster, the CEO of Foster Enterprises. You're dealing with one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the country." The words hung in the air like an electric charge. For a moment, everything froze. Reed's eyes widened, and she glanced from the radio to James, then back to her partner, her face draining of color. Daniel stood motionless, his hand still hovering over the cuffs, as if he'd been caught in the act of something unspeakable. Silence. James met Reed's gaze, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was palpable. His posture shifted ever so slightly, subtle but significant, as the weight of the situation settled into the officers' minds. For a brief second, Reed's authority crumbled. The composure she had tried so hard to maintain faltered, and her hands trembled ever so slightly. The realization crashed down on her like a thunderclap. She stammered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. "What the hell?" she muttered, barely audible. James didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. With slow, deliberate movements, he wiped the dust off his jacket, his shoulders squared, his composure regained. The man who had been treated like a criminal just moments ago was now someone far more powerful, someone whose influence was undeniable. He took a step forward, and his voice, calm but firm, broke the stillness. "I'm sorry, officer, but I believe you owe me an apology." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Reed looked caught between anger and shame, but there was nothing she could say, nothing she could do. The tables had turned, and now James Foster had all the power. The officers fumbled for their words, their voices wavering with nervous stammers as the reality of the situation sank in. Reed muttered a half-hearted apology, her voice lacking any real sincerity. Daniels was still frozen, unable to process the shift in power. The tension between them was thick, almost suffocating. But the damage was done. James had known all along the power his name carried, the weight of his position, but he had allowed them to humiliate him anyway. He stood there for a moment, letting the silence hang heavy. He didn't need to say anything more. The officers knew they'd misjudged him, misread the situation. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and now they would never forget. But as James turned to walk away, there was no satisfaction in his heart, no vindictive pleasure in watching them scramble. The truth was, revenge wasn't what he was after. Justice wasn't about making others feel small. It was about restoring balance. As he moved toward his car, James felt the weight of the moment settle in. His pride wasn't wounded. It had been bruised and built back stronger. He didn't need them to apologize. What mattered was the lesson they would take away, and the one he'd learned too. True power wasn't in dominance. It was in restraint, in control. He slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, the engine purring to life. The rearview mirror reflected his calm face, but his mind was racing. This incident was just the start of something much bigger. His path to respect, to real justice, had only just begun. The officer's awkward stammering and fleeting apologies would fade in his rearview, but the battle for dignity was far from over. It was only a matter of time before they would realize who he really was. And when that moment came, they would understand what true power looked like.